Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. I'm Stephen Meyer, and today we're doing part 3 of actually a 5-part YouTube presentation series, all based on my essay entitled, Is Conflict Needed for Great Heavy Music? The Case of Aerosmith, UFO, and Yngwie Malmsteen. In this episode, we're concentrating on UFO, all right? And we're going to start by looking at, I guess, an overview of UFO. I'm going to briefly go through their discography, but I'm going to do more than just that. I'm going to isolate the era of UFO that is widely considered their most successful, right? And successful both commercially and critically. And we're also going to see it's this particular era that the band is in sort of a constant state of turmoil. So it might be tempting for many to say, lots of conflict going on here. This is what's causing this incredible run of albums in this era. Now, I'm largely going to refute that, and I'm going to offer what I think is a better explanation as to why that particular era of UFO is especially successful. All right, so let's kind of run right into this. And we'll start by sharing my screen as always. And you know the links are available at the bottom of this YouTube presentation if you want to read the text in its entirety, which leads you right to my website. And you can read all my other essays too, if you would like. Okay. So zooming on down, past there, did Aerosmith in part 2. So if you're into Aerosmith, check that out. All right, here we are. So UFO, when and why was UFO great? Okay, so the folklore often associated with UFO, or the myth that sort of relates to this overall theme that, you know, artists must suffer for their art, that sort of thing that we've been exploring in this series, is that Michael Schenker's madness drove UFO to greatness, right? So there's people who think that, and I'm really not on board with that. Okay, unlike Aerosmith, which again, as I said, we looked at in part 2, British rock institution UFO has had numerous lineup changes since their inception in 1970, okay? The only constant in UFO has been vocalist Phil Mogg, all right? But co-founding members Pete Way on bass and Andy Parker on drums were definitely long-serving and present on the majority of the band's albums. So more on these things in just a second. Probably because UFO has always been viewed as a guitar-based band, many assess UFO's several incarnations around the lead guitar position. And that's really how I'm breaking up their catalog, as we're going to see in just a second. Although we should say they're not just a guitar-based band. Various stints by, most notably, I guess, Paul Raymond and Neil Carter on keyboards and rhythm guitar certainly widened their sound quite substantially, right? But nevertheless, the following table summarizes UFO's studio albums by lead guitar era. So that provides a nice little summary. We're going to go to a figure I sort of just put together for this presentation to sort of maybe describe this a little better. And so let's go ahead and do that. And like I say, I'll give the overview and then highlight sort of their most successful era. So here we are looking at UFO's albums. Again, I won't go through each album. There's just too many. And again, this isn't really the place for that anyhow. Okay, so we'll start in the first era. And I'm going to say, let me say one quick thing about UFO in general. Well, actually, 2 quick things for people that aren't that familiar with this band. Yes, I am breaking their discography down by lead guitar position, which might imply that lead guitar is the most important part of UFO. And yeah, it's a big part, all right? They're probably most known for some of their guitar players. But I have to say, the constant member, Phil Mogg, at vocals is a incredibly underrated vocalist and songwriter. Now, I hesitate to use the word underrated when it comes to a lot of hard rock and heavy metal bands, because frankly, most of the bands I listen to are underrated, so to speak, right? But Phil Mogg to me is the definition, okay? This guy, okay, let me put it another way. Sometimes, you know, I'm sure if you're a fan of hard rock and heavy metal and you're talking to people who aren't, And sometimes you'll begrudgingly get them to admit, yeah, they're pretty good musicians and sure they can play, but man, they sure can't sing, right? That all they do is scream or they growl, you know, and that sort of thing. And you know what? Yeah, to somebody who's not into this type of music, I'm sure that's how it would sound, right? I mean, a lot of vocalists, it's the delivery. They're not trying to be perfect singers in terms of hitting all the right notes or perfect vibrato or that sort of thing, right? But we do have some vocalists in hard rock and metal that even the non-enthusiast would have to admit are pretty darn good in terms of singers, right? I mean, Freddie Mercury from Queen is maybe the classic example there. It would be hard to find anybody who would say Freddie couldn't sing. Right? You might not like what he's doing, and that's fair enough, but it would be hard to imagine somebody saying he can't sing, right? Or in a more metal way, say a guy like Ronnie James Dio, right? Rainbow, Black Sabbath, the band Dio, etc. Again, you might not like the heaviness of Dio, but for anybody to say Ronnie James Dio can't sing, well, I'm not sure what you're listening to, right? Or Rob Halford from Judas Priest, Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden, again, same thing. You might not like what they do, but you certainly would have to admit these guys can sing. Well, add Phil Mogg to that list. All right. Phil doesn't sing quite as high, say, as Freddie did or Halford or Dickinson. He has a sort of a lower sort of tone to him. Think Paul Rogers from Free or Bad Company. Neither are particularly heavy metal well, Bad Company got a little hard rocking once in a while, but Phil's more in that style, right? But again, I think as far as a vocalist goes, this guy more people need to hear this guy, bottom line. And now in Europe and Japan, a lot of people are on to Phil, but North America, sometimes he sort of gets kind of falls through the cracks, which is really a shame. He can handle the hard rocking tunes. He can handle the ballads. He can handle the bluesier tunes. He can handle everything, right? And he really, really sings. So that's one thing I want to point out about UFO. The second, I think UFO are absolutely masters at the so-called light and shade style of music, right? Probably the epitome of light and shade would be Led Zeppelin. In fact, to my knowledge, Jimmy Page probably made that phrase famous, that he said Zeppelin was always shooting for this light and shade. And I think what Jimmy Page was talking about was the idea that, at times we're going to be really heavy and really hard rocking and very intense, very aggressive. And then we're going to be much more subdued and much more sort of colorful, right? Even get into ballads once in a while, thoughtful ballads, etc. And this sort of contrast in music can go throughout an album, or indeed even in certain songs. Songs will build, they'll sort of hit a crescendo and they'll fall off, that sort of thing. And no question, Zeppelin were masters at the light and shade. Well, here's another one. UFO, absolutely incredibly good at light and shade. When they rock, they really rock. But they can write really convincing, slow, call them ballads if you want, right? But incredibly good at atmospheric sort of dynamics. And again, they can go from one to the other. Within every album has a lot of light and shade, or almost all their albums, and often songs within the same song. So a very complex, very thoughtful sort of band that don't get enough credit for their incredible songwriting prowess, and indeed their incredible vocalist who's been with them all the way through, Phil Mogg. Okay. That aside, let's go through their discography very quickly, and we'll sort of see which era of UFO is widely acclaimed as the most successful in terms critically as well as commercially. Well, UFO starts in the 70s, right? Really early 1970, really. And I'm calling this the Mick Bolton era because Mick Bolton was the lead guitarist at this point. So again, we got Phil Mogg on vocals, we got Pete Way on bass, and Andy Parker on drums, and then Mick Bolton on guitar. The band is really just finding their footing here. I think these are all pretty good albums, but they're for the fans only, as a lot of people might say. The first album has a bit of a mixture of blues, some maybe a little boogie rock, a couple spacey things. The second album is definitely space rock. In fact, it basically tells you it's 1 hour of space rock, UFO 2. In fact, it's the one time the music really matches the name of the band, UFO, because it feels like just space rock all the time. Not unlike sort of maybe what Hawkwind might do, although this is maybe a little more guitar jammy. And then I think a good live album that caps this era, right? Then Michael Schenker joins the band in 1974 for the Phenomena album. And this is by far their most successful era. This is the era that most people know UFO for. I would say there's a lot of songs in this era that even if you're not a UFO fan, you've probably heard of. And Michael Schenker was ultimately proved to be the missing link in the band. He replaces Mick Bolton. Schenker at this point, when he joins the band in 74, is still just a teenager. So this guy's really a prodigy. In fact, Michael Schenker, he's a German. The rest of the band were British. Michael Schenker actually recorded his first album when he's only 16. The very first Scorpions album, by the way, called Lonesome Crow, Michael Schenker was the original member, along with, not to be confused with his brother Rudolph, who has been the rhythm guitarist of the Scorpions all the way through their illustrious career as well. But Michael Schenker originally was on the first album, and then Uli Roth took over for him for Fly to the Rainbow, et cetera, right? So UFO stole Michael Schenker away from Scorpions in 1974, and immediately it was clear. We've got a pretty special, pretty astounding guitar hero on our hands here, even though he's just a teenager at this point. Michael Schenker was such a great fit for UFO because Michael Schenker is a magician at the light and shade plane of guitar. He can write the heaviest, hardest rock and riffs that you're going to find almost anywhere. But man, when he wants to play melodic, this guy, I don't think he has a peer, you know? So he can do the whole gamut of guitar. His tone is impeccable. Like I say, his sense of melody, I don't know I've ever heard a guitarist as melodic as Michael Schenker. And then he can rip. And I mean rip with a capital R. So this guy, again, perfectly, you want to rock out, Schenker can handle that. You want to do a ballad with lots of melodies, Schenker can handle that. And on it goes, right? He can play blues. He can play some folky stuff. The guy's everywhere. And he's unique. Nobody really sounds like Michael Schenker. He's got a lot of copiers, kind of like Eddie Van Halen, which we'll talk about later. Lots of people copied Eddie, especially in Europe. Yeah, lots of people copied some of the stuff Schenker was doing. Look no further than, I love him, but Iron Maiden lifted quite a few riffs from this man. But there were lots of others too. Anyway, so Phenomena was the first album. A couple drop-dead classics from UFO on this album, Doctor and Rock Bottom, probably to this day, two of their all-time signature tunes. Then we get to the second album with Michael Schenker, an album called Force It. A little heavier than Phenomena, but still lots of light and shade going on. When it rocks, it really rocks. And then there's some really beautiful ballads on there too. Let's see, Mother Mary, Out in the Streets, This Kids, Let It Roll. Those would be probably the top songs from this album. Also, those songs also have long life in their set list. These are songs they still play to this day. Third album with Michael Schenker, No Heavy Petting. Probably not as many classics. Great album as well. Not as many classics. Natural Thing probably is the most popular song from this album. This album is also noteworthy. The band expanded their lineups. They now have a full-time keyboard player. Danny Pyronol is on this album. It's the only album with UFO he is on, but he did set a precedent for mixing in some keyboards with Schenker's massive guitar going on, and it worked. That actually really worked well with Schenker. Then we get to Lights Out, probably their most overall successful studio album, I think it's fair to say. I mean, there's songs I still hear on satellite radio. I mean, these, in addition to, say, Doctor and Rock Bottom, I mean, Lights Out, the title track, you'll hear Too Hot to Handle, quite a popular song from UFO. Love to Love, again, beautiful building ballad to something that gets really heavy. Good light and shade going on there. Obsession, the last studio album with Michael Schenker, at least in this era, another really, really good and popular album, again, in the canon of UFO. Only You Can Rock Me is, I would say, the most popular song from this album. But many Michael Schenker aficionado will say this was the beginning maybe of Michael Schenker's absolute peak. He's had a lot of peaks, by the way. Like, this guy has been good all throughout, and he's still amazing these days. But really, it might start with Obsession. I'm going to get to this in a second, but an absolutely undisputed classic live album. And then Michael leaves, and he starts his own band called Michael Schenker Group, or MSG. And then the first couple MSG albums are also considered absolute must-haves for people who love guitar and good songwriting, I might add too. So MSG 1, MSG 2, probably Assault Attack. So like I say, for most people who know Michael Schenker will say this is one of his peak, if not his peak in his entire career. And he's released a ton of albums. So from Obsession to Strangers in the Night to the early MSG stuff. Okay. Then we get to, yes, the album called Strangers in the Night. I think beyond a doubt, their most important album in their entire catalog, and even being a live album. Now in the 70s, live albums often were the catalyst for a lot of bands' careers. Think of all the amazing live albums that came out in the 70s. And this one is widely considered not only probably UFO's biggest album, but it's one of the best live albums of all time, right? In fact, it's so important to the band's career. A big chunk of this double album set still gets played, got played in their concerts all the way through their career. A big chunk of it, right? Okay, so this is undisputably the band's most successful era. And I'll get to this a little more when we get back to the essay. It's also a time when they were in almost constant turmoil. As great as Michael Schenker is as a guitar player, writer, etc., drama seems to follow this lad around. And I'm not going to say it was all Schenker's fault, because I mean, who knows, right? But there was something very flammable, let's put it that way, in the UFO camp whenever Schenker was involved, and he was a few times. So we'll get to this. He actually left the band a couple times around this time, and then ultimately left, at least for a long period of time, after the very wildly successful Strangers in the Night live album. So then we get to the Paul Chapman era. So Paul Chapman replaces Michael Schenker on lead guitar. And while I truly believe these four albums to be absolutely stellar, great songwriting as always. Phil Mogg is top of his game as usual, right? And Paul Chapman is no slouch. This man can play guitar, and he's pretty good at the light and shade approach that UFO was beautiful at as well. But he really couldn't follow Schenker's guitar charisma, if I could put it that way. And while these albums did do reasonably good business when they were first released, none of the songs from these albums have the legs that the songs from these albums have, right? It's rare to see UFO, because I've followed their set list for a lot of years. It's rare that you see any song from this era played, frequently throughout the years. I mean, when they were touring the album, sure. But once we got beyond the Paul Chapman era, a lot of these songs were rarely played. And by the way, though, I would highly recommend every one of these albums. Again, if you like very melodic hard rock, light and shade, admittedly still really good guitar playing, not to Michael Schenker era levels, perhaps. I mean, I'm not sure anybody could anyway, right? But still really amazing albums. So No Place to Run. The Wild, the Willing, the Innocent, which is one a personal favorite of mine, as a matter of fact. Mechanics and Making Contact are not too far behind either. Okay. Then so Paul Chapman bows out. In fact, a lot of the band bows out. When we get to Misdemeanor and Ain't Misbehaving, actually, Phil Mogg's the only original member at this point. Andy Parker and Pete Way are gone at this point, too. They come back, but they're gone at this point. Schenker's long gone, of course. Paul Chapman has left the band at this point. And then, so the guitar players we have are Atomic Tommy M. and Lawrence Archer. So Atomic Tommy M is on Misdemeanor and Ain't Misbehaving, and Lawrence Archer is on High Stakes and Dangerous Men. These are the least, I would say, the least successful parts of the UFO discography. Certainly, I would say critically, but also probably commercially too. A lot of these albums have pretty much been forgotten in time. The band was going for a different approach, definitely poppier, definitely more commercial. Now, both Atomic Tommy and Lawrence could definitely play guitar. They were shredders as well, but their guitar styles never really seemed in sync with the band's direction, at least to my ears, and I guess to a lot of people's ears, because again, these albums are not revisited in any meaningful way. High Stakes and Dangerous Men may be a little heavier. Pete Way at least is back for this album, so perhaps that helps. But again, these albums really never really gained much traction. And then, oh boy, we get to 1995 to 2002, and the Wonder Man, the Wonder guitarist is back, Michael Schenker. So he's back for Walk on Water, Covenant, and Sharks. But I got to tell you, commercially, these albums didn't even touch the first go around with Michael Schenker here, right? And I'll get into reasons why I think that's true in a second. But just to sort of, provide the overview. Even though Schenker's back, and so is Pete Way, Andy Parker comes back, longtime keyboardist and rhythm guitarist Paul Raymond's back. So you got the classic lineup. And the albums are great. Don't get me wrong. I think all three of these albums are absolutely essential, especially if you're a Michael Schenker fan. But even if just a UFO or a hard rock fan, these are tremendous. They're beautiful albums, right? But they just never really caught on. We'll see why. But by the way, the turmoil was still very much there. So you might say, oh, well, the reason these albums weren't so great, perhaps, is because was the band getting along with Michael Schenker? No, they were not. If anything, the relationship was even more strained. Schenker actually left after Walk on Water. He came back for Covenant. In fact, I think he may have left even between each album, but they patched it up enough, and then they hated each other, and on it went back and forth, right? But really, what's happening here? UFO has really become relegated to a niche market, right? It's diehard UFO fans, kind of like myself, I suppose, that are always going to buy their stuff and just consider ourselves lucky that we know about this great band, or get people who just love Guitar Hero, like the Guitar Hero sort of thing. People, sort of a niche market of guitar fanatics, which I also happen to be, right? But again, wide appeal is sort of over for the band. And sadly, I'd have to say that's the case for the last era of UFO too. Now, Vinnie Moore replaces Michael Schenker. The band is certainly getting along a lot better with Vinnie Moore, so there isn't near the drama, but there also isn't near the success. And again, they're great albums. Every single one of these albums are great in my mind. I mean, they're just excellent. The band are just incredible songwriters. Vinnie Moore is a great player, a shredder in every sense of the word. He actually, if there's any little criticism I could give to Vinnie Moore, at times he plays a little too much like Michael, perhaps. But he's his own man too. I'm not saying he's a clone or anything like that. But he's a fantastic player, fantastic writer. Phil Mogg's still awesome. He's still Phil Mogg, right? You Are Here, The Monkey Puzzle, The Visitor, Seven Deadly, A Conspiracy of Stars, and then the very last album we've gotten from UFO, the Salentino Cuts, which is actually a covers album. So the last of the original material is A Conspiracy of Stars, right? UFO is still alive today. In fact, I think they're planning a farewell tour this year. I mean, if conditions improve in 2022. But from what I can tell, or at least what they're saying it now, we're probably not going to get any new material from UFO, which is sad. But all things come to an end. Phil's in his 70s, and on it goes, right? Okay, so that's a kind of a. So again, there are no super popular songs from this era that people are going to know, like that you're going to hear on, say, satellite radio or things like that. Sadly, I mean, I think it should be. I think we should hear all kinds of stuff, but you don't. It's not an era that I think is not particularly commercially successful. It's not widely known. I think critically it's great. Same with the second era of Michael Schenker, really the same thing. Just an amazing number of great songs that nobody hears, right? Okay. So let's go back to the essay. Okay. So there's no question that UFO's most successful time was when German guitarist Michael Schenker joined them in the mid to late 1970s, and that run of, as I was saying, from Phenomena to capping it with the career-defining live album Strangers in the Night. There's no question that's their most successful era by a long shot, really, right? Okay. So in addition to providing some timeless hard rock classics, which at times verged on metal, by the way, sometimes this band rocked really, really hard, that you could say some of the stuff they were doing was pretty much metal, I think. UFO is also infamous for its substance intake. Such notoriety can be attached to virtually any era of UFO, perhaps with the exception of the latter day period with Vinnie Moore. They pretty much cleaned up. I guess they probably kind of had to, although we did lose Pete Way along the way. He has been dead for a few years. Correspondingly, UFO is equally renowned for its intra-band drama, right? More times than not centered on Michael Schenker, okay? Indeed, Schenker left the band several times during his tenure in the 70s. So when they were at their absolute peak, right? Schenker was basically in and out of the band. A lot of people didn't realize that because he was always on each album, but he fled a few times from the band. Often these departures occurred after disputes with Phil Mogg. The two really didn't get along that well at times. But other reasons surfaced as well. Schenker left UFO to escape the mounting pressures of fame. he is a pretty complex guy, and fame really doesn't work real well for him at times, as it seems. Other factors, spiritual, religious motivation sometimes caused Michael to leave. He's also a very religious guy. Or cultural incompatibilities with the UFO band and crew. Especially early on. I mean, Michael Schenker really couldn't speak a whole lot of English, and at times it seemed like he felt kind of alienated within the band of largely, people speaking English. They were Brits, right? When asked, Phil Mogger, Pete Wade typically blamed it on substance abuse as to why the band was in turmoil and couldn't get along, or just that their undeniably gifted guitar player was unfortunately crazy, right? Which actually became a bit of a moniker and even a marketing ploy for Michael Schenker later on. In fact, he was sort of known as, Mad Michael Schenker. So he kind of played it up, and got a little publicity out of it. I mean, he's got a song called Attack of the Mad Axeman on his second MSG solo album. Absolute amazing song. So again, he kind of played it up, kind of made it work for him. But nevertheless, Schenker was always a different cat. Let's put it that way. During Schenker's disappearances, he would be replaced by fill-in guitar players on tour. Somewhat ironically, actually, Paul Chapman filled in for him a few times before he officially left on the Strangers in the Night tour, for instance, until Paul Chapman eventually took over full-time as the lead guitarist. The volatility in UFO was most certainly fueled by the band's penchant for drugs and alcohol, which was reportedly legendary in hard rock circles. I can't tell you. I mean, obviously I'm really into this stuff. So I've read a ton of biographies and autobiographies and all kinds of heavy rock bands and metal bands, et cetera. And I can't tell you how many times I've read, the UFO partying and debauchery was absolutely legendary, right? I mean, UFO, of course, toured with all kinds of bands. So sometimes they open for other bands or bands open for them. And it's amazing how often everybody seems to have a UFO story, right? Where they reached levels of debauchery that well exceeded, the norm of even seasoned, hard rock star partiers, right? That they were kind of on a different level, right? And by the way, and this was in the 70s and into the 80s, incidentally, Michael Schenker's return to UFO 15 years later, as I was pointing out, like for Walk on Water, Covenant, and Sharks, proved no less volatile. So as I was saying, they had all kinds of drama with Michael originally when they had their most successful run in the 70s. And when he came back in the 90s, even though those albums weren't as successful, critically, I think they were just as good, but they weren't getting along any better. In fact, probably worse, right? Okay, so bringing it back to our overarching theme of, conflict, does conflict create great music kind of thing? Because the 1970s Schenker era reached disproportionate heights of acclaim, and it did, right? And the drama around UFO appeared to peak whenever Schenker was a member. UFO has always been a popular case in point for those determined to propagate the conflict creates great art argument, right? The UFO, kind of like we did with Aerosmith, that there's a certain era of UFO that people point, the reason that was so successful, well, they were in turmoil. In other words, the alleged reason for the phenomenon, the Strangers in the Night hot streak, is due to climaxing clashes within the band, and the assumption that such artistic achievement would never have been possible in more tranquil times, right? But again, I'm convinced that applying any causation or correlation in this regard is a mistake. And again, I talk about, this more precisely what I mean by causation and correlation in part one, if you're kind of following this series, right? I think the primary reason for UFO success in the 1970s was because of its temporal correspondence with the rise of guitar heroism, right? In conjunction with exceptional songwriting. So I'm going to elaborate on that a little more coming up. If conflict played any role in UFO, it only served to short circuit the band's consistent rise and negated UFO's chance to join the upper echelon of hard rock acts of the day. UFO never sort of broke through to the upper level, right? And I would argue if conflict played any role, it prevented them from doing that. Okay. So let me elaborate though on this idea of, the importance of great guitar, great songs, and timing. And I think that's what made that 70s era of UFOs so incredibly magical, although it's all pretty great, but certainly that era is what everyone can agree on. Okay. So we got to put this in a little bit of context here. So see if you kind of agree with some of this stuff. Although the age of the guitar hero probably starts in the late 1960s with, Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton. I think that's probably Jeff Beck would be another one, right? It is the 1970s that will always be known for its guitar gods, right? Virtually any hard rock or proto metal or blues rock band, for that matter, with roots in the 70s, achieved legendary status in part because of an exceptional guitar player, right? I challenge you to name any hard rock band, right, that became really popular in the 70s that didn't have a hot shot guitar player, right? It was pretty much a prerequisite, okay? Hard rock or say a proto metal, because I'm not sure we really had metal bands yet in the early 70s, really got to get to later 70s, right? Find me a band that didn't have a hot shot guitarist, right? They all did. Few examples. And again, I'm guessing most people will, and there'd be others I'm sure you could think of. Black Sabbath had the immortal Tony Iommi, right? The king in my eyes. Led Zeppelin had Jimmy Page, not too shabby. Deep Purple and Rainbow had the incomparable Richie Blackmore. Queen had Brian May, the best part of Queen as far as I'm concerned. Kiss, okay, maybe this is a little controversial for some folks. Not for me. Ace Frehley is a bona fide guitar hero and Kiss had one for a while. Rush, Alex Lifeson, come on, right? Uriah Heep, Mick Box. Blue Oyster Cult, the underrated Donald Roser, right? Incredible guitar player. Another underrated player, Nazareth, had Manny Charlton. Of course, we all know about Billy Gibbons and the amazing ZZ Top. Judas Priest had a couple, KK Downing and Glenn Tipton. Mountain, who could forget Leslie West? The Scorpions had Yuli John Roth, at least in the early parts of the Scorpions, right? Montrose had Ronnie Montrose. And then, of course, there's Ted Nugent, there's Robin Trower, there's the amazing Rory Gallagher, and on and on and on and on it goes. It was truly the age of the guitar hero at that time, right? However, it's more than just being a guitar wizard. These aforementioned bands and guitarists realized fame and or critical acclaim by encasing guitar playing expertise within excellent songs. It's one thing to be able to play like Tony Iommi or Richie Blackmore, but if they didn't have those amazing songs with their playing, it probably wouldn't have mattered as much, right? So you needed both, okay? Arguably, the formula of great guitar and great songs peaked with Edward Van Halen, right, in 1979. Van Halen reached an exceptionally wide audience. I don't think any band's really been this wide that I can think of. Hard rockers like Van Halen, metal people like Van Halen, not everybody, but certainly part of Van Halen's audience were metal fans. I'm part of that for sure. Rock and roll fans like Van Halen, even some pop dance fans like Van Halen, along with other guitarists loved Van Halen and guitar aficionados, people who just loved guitar, of course, loved Eddie, right? So all of this whole diverse group could agree on the brilliance of Van Halen, right? If not the group, certainly the guitarist, right? In fact, the Van Halen method was so effective that it was repeated ad nauseum until the music scene became flooded with technically gifted guitar players with, at times, matching songwriting abilities. So Eddie was it wasn't just Eddie. You had people like Randy Rhoads coming through too. So there were others. But Eddie, I think, was definitely the kingpin coming through. And so the problem was Eddie was that formula was so successful, big guitar player with, good songs or hopefully good songs, that by the 1980s, a great guitar player was no longer truly special, right? There was a bunch of great guitar players out there. And it became increasingly difficult for a guitarist to become discernible from others in terms of style and tone. There were a ton of Eddie Van Halen clones out there. Oh, they could play like crazy, don't get me wrong. but they didn't sound like anybody. They didn't sound like anything different or anything special. And that was really important in the 70s. All of those guitarists I name in those bands and others, they all sounded distinct. They all were unique. Like people who listen to this type of music routinely, you could just drop into the middle of a Zeppelin song and, oh, that's Jimmy Page, right? Or Ted Nugent. You could hear his style a mile away, or Iommi's, or Blackmore, or Rory Gallagher. You knew they had a distinct style. Brian May, you just boom, that's me. Like you only got to hear a few notes, right? That became hard. You didn't hear that after the 80s and beyond. There was a million great guitar players, but most didn't really distinguish themselves, right? Okay, so most of the guitar wizards in contemporary times, and there's lots of them, and they're amazing, don't get me wrong, but most of the guitar wizards in contemporary times have either become relegated to niche markets, right? That really their fan base is quite modest and it's mostly populated with guitar freaks, right? I mean, I'm part of that too, I would say. So it's people like Steve Vai, Yngwie Malmsteen, more on Yngwie in the next part 4, actually. Eric Johnson, John Petrucci, Steve Morse, Zach Wilde, there's lots of them, right? So either, the guitar wizards today, they're sort of part of a more specialized market, you might say, or they populate the endless number of metal bands who all tend to have musicians of incredible caliber. I mean, there's a gazillion great metal bands out there today, and every one of them has a killer guitar player, right? So like I say, now often they don't sound particularly unique, but they sure can play. So my point is, it's not special anymore. Guitar heroism is no longer a big thing. It just assume if you're in hard rock or heavy metal, yeah, you can play and you're not that special and you really don't sound unique, which I think is really important too. So as a result, since the late 1980s, very few hard rock or metal guitarists have been able to distinguish themselves to wider audiences in the way that, say, Hendrix or Blackmore or Iommi or Van Halen could in years previous. The only exception might be Joe Satriani. He is definitely a guitar shredder. I think he has reached beyond the niche market. More about Joe, actually, when I talk about Yngwie in part 4, okay? But generally speaking, that formula I talked about before for success in the 70s for hard rock bands, you needed to have great songs, you needed that guitar hero, and timing. Well, that sort of goes away by the time we get into the 80s because we're over the era of the guitar hero, right? So that no longer becomes sort of a recipe to get you to wider audiences. The novelty's worn off, say, for the average fan. So unless you're a guitar freak, right? Like, I mean that in a nice way because I'm a guitar freak too. It doesn't impress you anymore. Lots of people play great guitar, right? Okay. So UFO's career-defining success in the mid to late 1970s period is timed perfectly with the rise of guitar heroism. So let's go back to my little diagram and we'll just sort of wrap this up, show you what I mean here. So again, this is the era, right, that's most widely acclaimed as UFO's most successful. Sure, there's lots of conflict going on, but to me that really, it's got nothing to do with it. All the stars were aligning here, right? You got UFO, a band that could always write terrific songs. You got this wonder kid, Michael Schenker, coming in, who is a bona fide guitar hero in every definition of the word, right? And you're in the era of the guitar hero. The guitar hero really matters at this point. That's all the stars lining up to make this easily the most successful part of UFO, okay? If we contrast that with other eras, something's missing, okay? The Mick Bolton era, Mick Bolton was a pretty darn good guitar player. So I could say I would say he probably was at least approaching a guitar hero, you could say, right? And we're in the era of guitar heroism. It's rising. It's maybe just beginning, but we don't have the great songs here, right? So one of those. So again, think of it. 3 ingredients have to happen: great songs, great guitar player, a guitar hero, and you need to be in the era of guitar heroism for this all to line up. So we got only 2 out of 3 here, right? We got the guitar hero, probably, in most people's ears, I think. We are in the era of guitar heroism. It's just beginning, but we probably don't have the songs to push it forward, right? Here we got all 3. Bang! So it was explosive and it blew up, and UFO, was at their peak here. Okay, so what's happening later, though? Okay, the Paul Chapman era, we're probably still we're still in guitar heroism. In fact, this is probably the peaking year. So here's the peaking years of Van Halen. We're starting to saturate guitarists out there. There's more and more out there, but I think we're still in the era of guitar heroism at this point. But what are we missing? Well, we still got the great songs, as I will argue until I'm dead how great these songs are in this era. I think it's criminal to me that UFO fans overlook this era in particular, because you're really missing out. Anyway, enough about that. But I got to say, what we're missing is the true guitar hero. I love Paul Chapman. This is not a knock against Tonka. That was his nickname. Sadly, he died a few years ago. But I don't think we can say Paul Chapman's a guitar hero, at least not to the level of, say, Michael Schenker, Richie Blackmore, Tony Iommi, etc. He just doesn't have that. That doesn't mean he's a bad player, because he's a great player. Doesn't mean he can't write songs. He's a great songwriter. He just doesn't have that certain something to put him over the top as a true guitar hero, right? So I think that's why these albums just didn't have legs. They sold well at the time, but they never really caught on to the wider audience in a lot of ways, or even the guitar aficionados. A lot of people, the guitar freaks, kind of followed Schenker right into MSG and might have they probably ignored this era of UFO a little bit because Paul Chapman just wasn't that guitar hero. So arguably you only got two out of three of those ingredients. We're still in the era of guitar heroism. We still got great songs, but we're kind of missing the guitar hero. Right, what we've got is a good songwriter who happens to play guitar, right? Not really a guitar hero, okay? And then we go forward, okay, so now to 95, 98, the guitar heroism is starting to saturate. So I'm not sure the guitar heroism is really pushing bands forward anymore. And if it is, it probably doesn't matter because we don't really have the songs here, even though these are both pretty good guitar players, right? So when Schenker comes back, hey, the guitar hero is back. And Schenker is a guitar hero by every sense of the word, right? And UFO is still writing amazing songs, but guitar heroism is over, right? By the 90s and 2000s, it's no longer special. The only people who are paying attention now are the guitar freaks, right? So if you're a Michael Schenker fan, of course you're going to love this. Or if you just love really good guitar playing, you're going to be all over this. But that's probably it, right? Because guitar heroism is over. And that really continues on with Vinnie Moore. Same story. We got the guitar hero, we got the great songs, but guitar heroism is long dead, long gone. So again, it's niche markets, right? That's who's going to buy this stuff, and that's what's happening. Okay, so just to wrap this up. Okay. So, therefore, the drama that surrounded UFO, particularly during their times with Michael Schenker, is really beside the point in terms of why Strangers in the Night capped the band's best years. In fact, again, like I was saying, the reason their best years occurred was because all three of those factors were happening. They had the guitar hero, Schenker, they had the great songs, and they were smack dab in the middle of the guitar heroism phenomenon, right? After that, they were missing one of those three ingredients in all the other eras, okay? So conflict had nothing to do with it as far as I'm concerned. In fact, it was not that conflict created great art for UFO. It was that conflict prevented great art from continuing, okay? If Schenker had not left the band at their peak in 1979 due to constant interpersonal struggles and substance abuse, who knows what artistic heights UFO could have achieved and how wide their audience may have become. As big as Led Zeppelin? Man, you think I'm nuts? I don't think so. Call me crazy, and that could well be. I wouldn't have ruled it out. I really feel that strongly. UFO, that era with Schenker, if that would have continued, right? If they could have somehow beaten the conflict, but they couldn't do it, this band, the sky was the limit for them. But it just wasn't to be. So conflict kind of killed UFO's chance, I think, of getting to the upper echelon. It didn't create great art. It prevented great art from continuing. Okay, that's it for part 3. Join me for part 4. Going to talk about all your Yngwie Malmsteen fans. Again, if you're a guitar aficionado, you'll want to check in with this because I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to continue on this conflict idea, right? That I'm going to keep critiquing this conflict creates great art, but I'm going to a little bit of spin on this one. All right. I'm also going to argue, though, artists that actively avoid conflict, that can be damaging as well. So a little bit of a spin to this. Anyway, I hope you'll join me for that. And I wish you well. Take care.